Okay. Oh, Michael. Where's Michael gone? Michael Rotet, wo bist du? Ah. Hey. Could you two guys sit near the standing microphone because we don't have any wandering ones? So if you want to go and sit there, I need you to speak, you can stand near the mic.
Well, then I walk over there.
Great. Can I borrow your watch?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if you're happy to walk, that's fine. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to plenary number 5, the penultimate plenary for the EuroDIG. And it is entitled very ambitiously, but unapologetically, Security, Internet Principles and Human Rights. My name is Marianne Franklin. I'm here on behalf of the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, but my day job is as an academic at Goldsmiths in the University of London. I have an extremely rich panel on the podium, and we have 3 wonderful people in the part of the room that we call the audience, but of course the part of the room who are also co-participants, ready to speak, and of course we invite you to take part as well. Okay, so just let me have a couple of minutes to frame the discussion today, because a lot of you might be thinking, oh goodness, 3 very big terms, obviously they're trying to do too much. And so my answer to that is yes, we are trying to do too much. And what is amazing about this plenary for me personally, and I hope for others in the room who've been around longer than I have in this kind of arena, is that this is a moment where you can put these 3 things in one title. You can actually talk about security and human rights in a real concrete way. It does not seem like a kind of oxymoron. And you can finally, at least since Net Mundial, if not before, consider internet governance principles within a human rights frame, and a human rights framework to consider how that might affect design of the internet and other technologies of communication and information exchange. So we here have a very challenging remit today, but we're going to rise to that challenge. And I just want to sort of note a couple of points. We have representatives, I think, from every sector that is involved in this area, whether it be issues about the limits and needs of national security measures online and offline, technical communities, engineers, we have the private sector represented here, we have former intelligence officers represented here, we have a whistleblower on the panel, so she can tell us what it really means to live as a whistleblower. Because Edward Snowden is, alas, not the only one out there who's taken these risks. And we have people who are working on behalf of the rights and protection of young people. And we have representatives from UNESCO and the Council of Europe. So I'm very, very honoured and privileged to be able to moderate this panel. I hope we have a lively discussion. I will do my best to make sure we do. And I'll leave the rest up to you. But just want to note something in The Guardian, a report on Al Gore, of all people. Al Gore, remember him? He's quoted as saying that the Snowden leaks were, I quote, an important service, and that revelations also put the onus on not only governments but internet companies to, and I quote Al Gore, pay attention to correcting some of the gross abuses of individual privacy that are going on in the business sphere. Now, what he's referring to, of course, is clearly that it's not just governments who've been misbehaving, and this kind of debate we're having about whose fault it really is at the end of the day. I hope we're going to get past that. It's about the everydayness of these issues. This isn't just cloak and daggers and John le Carré and the spy who came in from the cold. This is actually very everyday. We are securitized and monitored every time we cross a border, every time we take money out of the hole in the wall, and even when we go online to get an education. More and more of this stuff is going online. So this affects us at everyday level. So the challenge in this panel is to link that everydayness, the abuses that are going on in insidious ways, creeping every day with the really big important issues that do concern us, about the limits of national security measures in the name of human rights, but also security measures that many people argue are actually undermining human rights. So we're working with a paradox anyway. So what I've done is we've talked to our panelists. I will introduce them very quickly, and then I'm going to put the first question to them, because someone earlier, I think it was yesterday, pointed out that we're often using one term, for instance, security or rights or principles, and we often think we're talking about the same thing when in fact we're not. So that's our little exercise to get things going. But first, allow me to introduce our panelists on the podium. Beginning on the far left, Leonid Todorov, who's representing techies, Russian civil society. Would that do? If I misrepresent you, please yell. To his left is Jan Malinovsky from the Council of Europe, from Human Rights and Information Society. That's, okay. And rule of law, of course, rule of law. And to his left is Annie Mation, who is a former British intelligence officer and whistleblower. And to her left is Gry Hasselbach, who's working for the Media Youth Centre of Media, the Danish Media Council. And to her left is Sir Richard Tilt, who is representing the Internet Watch Foundation. And to his left is Xian Hong, Hu from UNESCO. And in the audience we have Jeanette Hoffman. Wave your hand. We all know who Jeanette is, but she needs no further introduction, but of course co-chair or joint chair of the Net Mundial meeting for multi-stakeholders and the civil society group. We have Michael Rotet, who is our kind and gentlemanly host, and we have Olivier Crépin-Leblanc, who's representing engineers. I'm really thrilled to get some engineers on the panel. So let's begin. The first question is, fingers on buzzers, what is your conceptualization of security? How do you, Leonid, understand security? And we've asked the panelists to try and do this in one sentence, because we're respecting the Twitter culture. So
security for me is safety on an individual, institutional, societal, and government levels, and confidence built between these 4 tiers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonid. Moving down the line, Jan?
Thank you very much. I think that we have to take security as being 2 things, an obligation and a necessity. Every state has to protect itself. That is a necessity. And there is also an obligation towards the citizens. The security of the state has implications also for the citizens. But the means in order to achieve this are not unlimited, they are not unfettered, and one has to be very careful as to how to deliver that security that is an obligation and a necessity.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. And Annie?
I start playing word association because of my background, so I inherently think of national security, which is a phrase much used and abused in the UK, which to me should mean the existential protection of a country against existential threats, but is much used and abused because it's not legally defined for the purposes of UK law, and it means it can be conflated with much fuzzier ideas such as the national interest or the government's interest, and because of that and lack of legal definition, we see the slide towards abuse and the slide towards a surveillance state.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, remember just basically what is the fundamental understanding of security that each panelist is bringing, at least to the beginning of this discussion. Hopefully they end up with another one by the end.
Yeah, coming from my perspective, I would like to use the child-parent metaphor, which can be transposed into many areas of life, also state-citizen. And I think there's 2 ways or 2 methods of achieving safety for your child. For example, if you're a parent, you can create safety through limitations of access to certain things, by embracing your child, by overlooking what they do, by controlling them. But you can also achieve security and safety by building confidence in your child, trust, knowledge about the world, skills to deal with the world. And of course, I think security is a combination, a very balanced combination of these 2 things.
Okay, thank you very much, Gry. Okay, Sir Richard.
Coming from the child protection arena as I do, I interpret security as safety in relation to the internet. I want to be able to use the internet without doing harm to anyone, and I also want to use the internet without any harm occurring to me.
Okay, thank you very much. And moving down, Xiaohong.
To me, security means freedom. A safe internet means to respect and enable freedom to exercise human rights.
Okay, freedom, safety, security. Olivier, I'm sure you have a definition. Oh, you're only allowed one right now.
It's one sentence. I just have to inhale very, very hard before that. Security to me is four different terms that are actually sometimes in contradiction to each other. You have the security of people, of the citizen, security of the state, security of the network, and security of the data. And unfortunately, the security of everything is a bit of a trade-off between one and the other.
Okay, thanks, Olivier. Michael, I think you want to...
Well, since working since over 40 years with computers, I make it much simpler than Olivier. I just have two parts. Security for me is mainly for the online world. Everything else is safety.
So define security for the online world. What do you mean by security?
If you want a definition of security now from me for the online world only, I mean safety, we don't have to explain that much, I guess. On a first shot, it is what is provided by the operating system in order to set the limits where to go and where not to go, for instance, or whatever, not having the machine abused by others over the net. This is the type of security I'm thinking of on the online world.
And Jeanette, anybody else who wants to add to our definitional database, please come forward.
So intuitively, I thought of it in a negative way as the absence of something. Security would be the absence of a threat, or security would be the absence of sort of essential insecurity. And then I looked it up at Wikipedia. It's a short one they offer. Do you want me to read it? Security is the degree of resistance to or protection from harm. It applies to any vulnerable and valuable asset, such as a person, dwelling, community, nation, or organization.
Okay, you can see already that it seems obvious that we're talking about the same thing, but I don't detect we're talking necessarily about the same thing. I don't know about the rest of you. So could I have someone, and then, yes, there's a standing microphone just there, sir. Could you please say who you are, just for the sake of us and the auto-cue?
Yeah,
auto-cue,
hello.
what do you call it?
My name is Kristo Helas for Electronic Frontier of Finland. I just wanted to highlight that they actually proposed to study the Copenhagen School of Security Studies. So they define the security quite differently as a discourse, the way to promote someone or something to be able to secure something. So in a way, security would be part of imperialism, part of way to part of discourse to define some areas or territories.
Okay, thank you. That's good. It's actually a narrative, a way of thinking. Now, all of you, don't go to sleep right now. This isn't university. Just want you to know that sometimes the way we talk about something affects what it is we talk about. Just had to put that in there. But Leonard, I'm sure you've got a response.
Thank you. Well, you know, we are in a very specific city, which was the capital city of the German Democratic Republic. And that was the most secure state in the socialist camp. Simply because every seventh, Wolfgang, am I wrong? Every seventh citizen of the German Democratic Republic was an agent of Stasi, the secret service. That was the most secure state. So my sense is that you can have either that other ultimate security or no security at all. So just to complement what Janet said. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard, for the very important historical point. Anybody from the panel? Okay, yes, please. We will just dwell on definitions for a moment, because definitions are deeply political, just in case you hadn't realized.
Right. Continuing on the deeply political, I define my security and safety in constitutional terms, insofar that if the politicians and the executive who have vowed to defend the Constitution, which protects my civil liberties, then I feel safe and secure.
Okay, thank you. Protection, safety, security. Okay, have we had, I'm thinking already a little bit beyond my own assumptions. I'd like to throw one security definition before I address some direct questions to our panel. Each of them, by the way, handed in what we call a blurb, very kindly handed a blurb in. That's a little statement about where they're beginning from for this panel, and 3 points. So we've put that up on the wiki page for this plenary because we believe there's a lot to cover, and you'll get an understanding of where our panelists are coming from in a deeper sense on that page. So we already have been in conversation. But before I ask my first set of questions to Gry and Sir Richard, because I want to start, if I may, with the everydayness of these issues, the granular part of actually what is protection and safety from the point of view of children and young people. Anne Tickner, who is an international relations scholar way back in probably the 80s, thought about this issue about whether it's all just about national security, Annie, if it's all really just to be defined by a protection from external threats, and she said, the concept of national security has been tied to military strength and its a role in the physical protection of the nation state from external threats. But then Tickner argues that this definition is partial at best. For a large proportion of the world, security has as much to do with the satisfaction of basic material needs as it has with military threats. So security and definitions about security do include, I think what Gry was trying to say, the more positive, empowering aspect. So I'd like to start straight away. Gry and Richard, you have very, very clear ideas about what is not working from the point of view of protecting minors, young people, as their lives are lived out more and more online. So I'd like to ask you, if I may, based on your blurbs, Gry, you say it's just not good enough to say everything's fine. You're very concerned about the fact that young people's lives have become archives, have become digital archives. So I'd like to sort of begin with that question, Gry, and have Sir Richard respond. Everyday security as protection for minors.
Well, since you're asking me so directly about archives and in connection with security and protection, I think there's 2 levels of this, and what we've been concerned with for a very long time now has been how to build confidence in kids around using social media and so on and so forth, using their data online. And when we look and ask young people about privacy, they'll be very skilled and very concerned with how they navigate with data, with close circles, with friends, with family, how they build groups, how they post images. But if you ask them about big data, every data mining, surveillance, they'll be understanding less about this. And this shows that there's a need for 2 ways, like the combination of skills and also someone else doing something. What I'm trying to say here is that there's one side of the problem that is social. One way of dealing with security and protection by building skills in young people, because this is about their social life. And then there's the other side, which is embedded in the technology, embedded in the way in everything they do every day, in their everyday life, where archives are built, and it's no matter how much knowledge you try to teach them, it's impossible for them to handle. So I think it's a very good sign of saying it's not one solution fits all. You need a combination of both.
So enabling, in terms of understanding security, is not just protection from external threats, but also protection from external threats. And that external threat is what you're saying is the very nature of their everyday life, in fact.
It is right now, yes, actually. But it's just more to say, to point out the thing that there's always two sides. When there's always been this friction between protection and rights when you have the child online debate. And normally I would say, okay, when it comes to cyberbullying, for example, this is about a social context. It's about how users use the internet. It's not embedded in the technology. It doesn't help that you limit their use of the social media. It won't change the problem. But when it comes to privacy, there's actually two sides. And one thing, they're really good at this thing with the social privacy of creating groups so people can't live, parents can't follow what they do and can't overlook them and putting nice pictures. But when it comes to the hidden, everything that's backstage, not in the front stage, there's something lacking there. There's a responsibility that we have, the ones building the services, the infrastructure.
Right. So that actually allows me to turn to Sir Richard. I'm sure in terms of this dark net, and Michael Rotet has already made a clear comment about this dark net. But just, Sir Richard, what's your comment on this theme?
Well, I think for conference participants who don't know, the Internet Watch Foundation is a small UK organisation which seeks to find and remove child sexual abuse material from the net. We do that both by getting our members, the internet industry, to take the material off if they can, or alternatively by blocking it if it's hosted somewhere else. I mean, we see, I'm not for a moment suggesting that we are solving the problem of child sexual abuse on the net. We are probably not much more than scratching the surface. The volume of material there is quite huge. We get about 50,000 public reports a year. About 80% of those will involve images of children under 10. 10% will involve images of children under 2. The images will depict the most appalling rape, torture and sexual deviance that anybody might imagine. We are very conscious of the human rights implications of what we do and are always anxious to see whether our processes can be improved in any way, including the availability of appeals against the decisions that we're making. We work very closely with the industry, with law enforcement and with government.
Okay, so when it comes to speaking about children and the abhorrent things that can be done to children, and of course others, and then how they can be displayed online, there always seems to be a moment we say, okay, that's when we intervene, that's when we actually take down, block and filter. So this of course raises this enormous question about the tension between freedom of access, openness, the rights of the young people. Sort of speaks of the need to be free to do what they want online without undue monitoring, and yet at the same time they need protection. So we're still working on this protection angle of security. Are there any comments on these two? And from the audience.
Marianne?
Yes, please.
Could I add something on the protection of journalists?
Yeah, go on, yes, Chan Hong, yeah.
Because to my understanding, I think that security is a universal concern and risk for everyone, not only to the children. Of course, they are more vulnerable. You know that with the internet, we have emerged that social media producers, citizen journalists, and bloggers who are also producing those public interest reporting, they are really at a front of being attacked online and offline. That's why the UNESCO has been traditionally protecting journalists, and recently we are leading the UN action plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. We extended the concept of the journalists to include those online media creators to help them, to protect them. And we're also going to launch a study on the digital security of online media actors in the forthcoming IGF. That's what our work on.
Okay, so there's a good point. There are a number of groups, journalists, children, if we want to protect them. But there's a very subtle distinction between protecting people from the consequences of what they do online, when those things that they do are considered okay, and protecting those whose images, who are being forced to do things that are then transmitted online. So we have some very important distinctions we have to make. But I think we have Vic here, Jabados, on our remote moderator, please.
Yes, thank you. Mariana, we have from Ripa George, Romania, to Annie Mechon. How can you say that national security is a phrase used too much when only in the UK dozens have lost their life in terrorist attacks committed by radical Islamists and when daily people are killed all over the planet for not being Muslim? And there is another question to Mr. Todorov. The East Germany was a tyranny and communist regime. We live in a democracy. For you, sir, there is no difference between a communist regime and a democracy. Don't you think that we should do whatever we can do to defend our freedoms and our life? And on Twitter we have one comment also on like how we want to define security without mentioning the word integrity. Thank you.
Integrity, okay, yes. Before Leonard intervenes, I'm just wondering if Annie could make a comment about, because we brought ourselves straight into the mouth of the whale, national security, and I believe that that was our remote participant, you know, do the means justify the ends? And this isn't just a trite question. So Annie and then Leonard.
Okay, yes, as you say, straight into the deep end. National security, the concept is there, and the agencies which are supposed to uphold and protect national security is to protect the integrity of a country. So, for example, Britain was under an existential threat during the Second World War. It was arguably under an existential threat during the Cold War as well. And that is why the intelligence agencies were given certain limited powers to take certain limited steps to protect the integrity of that nation. However, now what we've seen is a sort of slide into using national security as an excuse for the spies to gather more and more powers. And as appalling as the attack of 7/7 was, where 52 people lost their lives in London in 2005, and as appalling as all the provisional IRA attacks were through the 70s, 80s and 90s, that was not an existential threat. That was just crimes, multiple murders, a terrible, terrible atrocity. But it's not a threat to the nation's integrity. And yet now we're seeing the intelligence agencies taking on more and more of this sort of work, counterterrorism, which used to be the preserve of police services rather than spy agencies. But they are doing it completely in the dark and grabbing more and more powers and taking away all our basic freedoms. And it's been quite a swift slide towards what is now effectively, and this, I'm saying this not to be melodramatic, it's the fact, if you look at the laws in the UK, effectively it is now a police state. If you look at the laws, they're not being applied to most people, but if you're a young Muslim male, you know full well what you risk. So that I think that we have to distinguish between the real threats to national security, existentialism, and terrible and appalling crimes. And of course, since 9/11, when the intelligence clubs came off, we've seen all our countries slide into this confusion. I just wanted to make one other very quick point about Facebook, actually. I completely hear what you say, but Facebook is the spy's wet dream, because we offer up all the information that the intelligence agencies and the Stasi had to painfully piece together over a period of months, and we just give it up for free. And a whole generation now really has grown up with this concept that they don't need privacy, they've got to be on Facebook, one, because it's cool, or two, perhaps because that's how they do their university classes sometimes, as happens in the Netherlands. So they are forced onto it. And I always see it as a sort of, and I don't want to be frivolous about this word, Sir Richard, but as a sort of grooming of a younger generation to give up the very notion of their privacies. And we need to tell them and get the information out there. No, actually privacy is important. It's a fundamental right for very fundamental reasons, which I'm sure we'll get onto later.
Thanks very much, Annie, for linking the big with the small. Thank you. But Leonard, yeah.
Just a quick... Yeah,
okay,
just
Leonard, yes, go.
Just a quick reaction to my online opponent's comments. Well, the issue of security is a very serious one, but it doesn't mean that it should be taken that seriously. See? Okay, so it shouldn't be taken that seriously. So the reason why I mentioned German Democratic Republic and security is that it is under any authoritarian or regime or even tyranny that residents feel most secure. I was the first Russian who entered Baghdad, Iraq, after the US takeover of Iraq. And I was telling my friends and colleagues from the US that if you don't care so much of whatever daily needs of residents there in Baghdad, if you don't take care, good care of whatever security there, I mean personal, individual security, you will be blamed within a few months, you will be blamed, and everybody will have that nostalgia about Saddam's time. Because in Saddam's time, Baghdad and Iraq was very safe. Just because, you know, there was that gas attacks against Kurds and no resistance, no guerrilla. So that is simple, that's one point. Another point is that, yes, there is no excuse from my perspective for, let's say, using national security, brandishing national security for the sake of total control of the population. We should strike that right balance between privacy and personal freedoms and rights, and the right of the government to know. For nearly all of you in this audience, you've never lived in the Soviet Union. I did. I mean, I still live in Russia, for that matters. And so you don't know how much privacy and individual freedoms and rights can be violated, trampled easily for the sake of national security behind the Iron Curtain, you know. So I know what I'm talking about.
Okay, thanks, Leonard. Jan has a comment he wants to make, and then Sir Richard, and then someone from the floor, and a request from a Twitterer if we could mention Snowden. Snowden.
Linking to what Leonid said and other comments that have been made already, I think that the notion of state security, and you did put in the notes for this session state between brackets, so that is where I'm focusing, state security.
Did you say Putin?
No. It may be that we are dealing with an outdated concept that is a remnant of the past, where certain state agencies were given considerable powers that would be totally unacceptable in a democratic society. And we have to take that and reconstruct that, the legitimate objective of security, which I said there is an obligation and there is a necessity if you want. But it has to be reconstructed, reconceptualized from a human rights perspective. And if I may quote what the Court of Human Rights has said, approximately, I'm not reading out of the text, it's my own note of memory, mass surveillance in the interest of state security or national security can destroy democracy under the cloak of protecting it.
Exactly. And again, my point about Snowden is this is the favor that Snowden has done us all. So please, Snowden, once again, is an important figure in this discussion. But actually, I think we need to hear from the floor. He's been standing there very, very patiently. Could you just say your name for the record, please?
My name is Stefan Herwig. I'm a civil society, but I used to study communication science, and I did a little research on exactly this topic. Would like to debunk one or two myths. Especially, we've been talking a lot about national security, but I would like to debunk the myth that has come up here, that freedom and security are antagonistic, because they're not. They complement each other, right? And I've heard here, this is the first year that I've been here, I've heard that we were talking a lot about a free internet. And obviously nobody's against a free internet, but let me tell you a few things about freedom. Especially if we talk about individual freedoms. Freedom also needs control, because if I'm free, I have my freedom, I do whatever I please, at some time I will get into a conflict with somebody else's freedom, right? So we need to have measurements in place to mediate between those, and then we need to have measurements in place to enforce. We need enforcement in order to, how can I say, enact freedom. Now when we're talking about the internet, right? Every time somebody says free internet, at the moment, at the current state, we don't have rules of enforcement, any rules. So it feels more like anarchy, right? Because that is freedom without rules, freedom without enforcement is anarchy.
Okay,
right?
thank you. I think, yeah.
Can I just make it to close the point?
Okay.
Right? At the moment, so that means anarchy means we will be sitting at the survival of the strongest. At the moment, the power is with the people, or is with the parties that can aggregate the most information, right? Because they're not being bound by any other regulation.
Okay, so thank you for making that point. So you're talking about freedom is not the unfettered ability to gather information and generate digital archives without due process and transparency.
I wanted to
and
say
restrictions.
that if you strike the right balance, these things will very, very well complement each other. But we haven't done a lot of basic work on these issues. Like, for instance, and I'm going to shut up in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
One of the main premises, for instance, for trying to set those rules is to set apart a concept that the Romans have actually already founded, to set apart the res publicae, the public domain, and the private domain. For internet regulation, hasn't done anything there. These things are completely off balance. The other thing is setting apart the level between anonymity, pseudonymity, and identity. And if we do that, then on top of that, we can start with enforcement.
Okay, so that's a clear program, because this is someone, thank you very much. I know I had to interrupt you, but this is, we're moving into the how. We've had lots of shoulds and musts, but try and think about the how. But I'd like to ask Sir Richard, because I know from your original statement, you are very clear that the internet, I think you agree, can never be completely free, because you're understanding freedom in a very particular way. Could you elaborate, please, from the point of view of child abuses of children online?
Yes, I actually wanted, I will do that, but I wanted to comment very much on what Annie said, because I agreed very much with her about what she said, and I understand the difference between an existential threat and, as it were, a criminal threat, and I have no doubt that, part of the kind of expansion of the intelligence apparatus is to do with the availability of that material much more easily than it was. Like you, I was dealing with the IRA in the 70s and 80s, and you couldn't have done those things then because the material wasn't available. Sorry, is it not?
That's better, thank you. Better?
Yeah. So I do agree very much. But there must be an issue about what you do about serious criminality. And I mean, our position, of course, is that the material we're dealing with is serious crime. And therefore, our response, we believe, is a perfectly proportionate response to the images that we're dealing with. But you can extend that argument to other forms of serious crime, because it is becoming much more possible to combat crime through use of the internet. And that is an issue for, it goes back to the last speaker, really. It's an issue about freedom. We would defend what we do very much because we think it is entirely proportionate. But it's not for me to draw the line about where is proportionate and where is not proportionate.
Okay, any comments on that particular point? Because we don't want to sort of end up, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose kind of conversation. Because the trouble is we're dealing with a lot of truisms if we're not careful, and black box terms. So I really appreciate the unpacking of what does it actually take. I think Olivier has a point about confusion of terms. Just quickly, and then we'll go to the next audience member, because are we not confusing the issues here, Olivier?
Well, I think that there is certainly a will from certain lobbyists to confuse the term network security with network robustness, with having an internet that is reliable, and at the same time having services that are trustable. There's a sort of mishmash between the different things. You sort of mix security with robustness, with security of your data, with the various points that I made earlier about the different types of security not always agreeing with each other and having to give up the rights about one type of security if you really want to have a stronger security in another type of security.
You're saying these are not mutually exclusive?
Not totally, but you can't have them all in the same bag. There's going to be a trade-off between all of them.
So could you just be more specific in terms of Sir Richard's point about actually that there is a place and a time to actually restrict and to enforce law online? I think Jan Malinowski will also want to speak to that. But
yeah, I think that it's been, in general, accepted in a certain way, provided there are checks and balances that are in place in order to make sure that these rights to stop information or to block things or to trace someone are not abused. And I think this is really the whole thing, being able to have those checks and balances in place and certainly following the law. What we have seen, unfortunately, recently is that those checks and balances and following the law has not actually taken place. And this is really a threat which is actually a threat to the personal security of people.
Okay, so Jan, I think you had a point there.
Yes, I think that's precisely the point. I would reformulate it slightly in response to Sir Richard as well. I would say that the bigger the threat, the bigger the power that is given to law enforcement or to whatever state agencies, the higher the accountability that we have to place, the higher the safeguards and the checks and balances and the scrutiny, even if it is ex post factum. It has to be very, very high. The standard has to be the maximum. We have seen things go badly wrong, for example, in respect of the fight against terrorism, with things sliding off into torture, systematic abuses of human rights, and so on and so forth. So the higher the power that is given, the higher the accountability, responsibility, transparency, even ex post factum, and consequently, the high interest that whistleblowers have. We need whistleblowers because where there is obscurity, we need to bring light. And that is why a few weeks ago, the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers, adopted a recommendation on the protection of whistleblowers.
Okay, thank you. We have Jeanette Hoffman from the floor. I'm going to, apparently there's feedback if I wander ahead of the speaker, so please let me know if this...
So nice of you to give me the microphone. I wanted to directly comment on what you just said, the higher the threat. It sounds so intuitively plausible, but how do you actually make sure that the threat is really a threat? And who is actually has the access to the data and the authority to define a threat? And can you also include defining and measuring a threat into this accountability scheme?
If I may come back.
Yes, very briefly, yes, absolutely. It's an important question, yes, please, and others as well.
Indeed. That is why I didn't leave it at the higher or the bigger the threat. I linked it to the bigger the powers. So whatever the purported threat is, if you give an agency more power, then the scrutiny has to be higher, the checks and balances have to be higher. Yes, exactly. Who will guard the guardians? We need that.
Okay.
And hence the need for, whenever something goes wrong, there is someone who knows. And we have to encourage the whistleblowers to come out and say it.
So people standing at the microphone, just bear with us just a little bit. I'd just like to keep this point rolling while we are onto it. Annie.
No, I think it's a very, very valid point that the more secret powers these agencies have, then the more accountability there should be. Having said that, the UK is a past master at not holding them to account at all. So up until 1989, for 80 years, the intelligence agencies did not officially exist, and our Parliament could not ask questions about them. Since then, there has been a degree of oversight with the Intelligence Services Act of 1994, and there is a parliamentary committee called the Intelligence and Security Committee. However, I know that senior spies regularly lie to this committee. I have seen that the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary, who are supposed to be the political masters of our spy agencies, routinely cover up their crimes. And I have seen the way that when they are challenged, when the commissioners and inspectors go in every year, the spies can game the process. So the inspectors never get the full story. This is not accountability. This is not transparency. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for the spies that have indeed been running amok since 9/11, with extraordinary rendition, with torture, with CIA kill lists, and with drone strikes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we will return. Okay, we have three people who've been standing very, very patiently. So even though you've been standing patiently, I do plead for you to be brief. Our first speaker, please.
Heiner Banking. I just chirped at the wall that we should consider if for trust security watching, we should not consider a spectrum of meaning or a field of meaning. And Margot said, values out of context are meaningless. So we, in concept and context mapping with UNESCO 20 years ago, said we can map it, so we can negotiate it. So this trust-making, multi-track diplomacy negotiating, that's what's going on. And we organized here in Berlin 8 years ago a whistleblower conference. So this is all out in the air, and my head is up for these people who spoke up. We just facilitate.
Okay, thank you very much for that support. Continuing to the other side of the room, thank you.
It's Jacob Dexter. My point has kind of been run away from, but I wanted to go back to the personal information, what we give away and what is supposed to be protected. And I would like to come back to the defining different terminology, and especially personal integrity and privacy. I don't think that we should assume that privacy and personal integrity means not having anything seen by anyone. Rather, personal integrity is a mechanism by which you create your own personal identity, where you decide to give away your own information to other people willingly. So I think that should be taken into account when you discuss what kind of information should be protected and what kind of communication should be protected in relation to security. Not everything is actually supposed to be secret either.
Okay, good point. So when you go into a public park, that doesn't mean that, at the same time, that doesn't mean you want someone sitting on your shoulder recording your conversation without your consent. And neither should everything be secret, yes. So continuing on this nuanced, more granular understanding, can we have the next speaker, please? Yeah.
Also, in the interest of clarifying the definitions at stake, I'd just like to make the point that we should dissociate the idea that mass surveillance actually had anything to do with national security of the US government. In the beginning, General Alexander said that the NSA prison program had allegedly stopped around 54 terrorist plots. Then after a number of studies, he later kind of said that it stopped maybe 20, only a handful. Then after President Obama called for an independent panel to review the actual results of the prison program, the NSA was reluctantly forced to admit that actually it had only really stopped maybe 1 or 2 terrorist plots. So please, can we not either explicitly or implicitly say that the NSA spying program actually did do anything to serve the national security of the US government? Thank you.
Okay, any comments on that? Yep. Jan? No? Okay, we kind of come to a sort of natural pause. Oh, John, of course, there you are. Okay, please. You want to continue on that theme?
Well,
or bring up a new one?
No, I actually want to rebut the last comment.
Okay, go for it.
This puts me way out.
Just say who you are.
So I'm John Laprise. I'm a professor at Northwestern University. The last statement is correct as far as it goes. When you understand, but it reflects an incomplete understanding of what the NSA was trying to do with its surveillance in terms of mass surveillance. When the NSA is all about raising costs to terrorists. So if the terrorists know that they're being mass surveilled, the process of initiating an attack gets harder. When Osama bin Laden was assassinated, you saw that he had multiple physical couriers. He wasn't using phones. These are the costs that the NSA seeks to impose upon terrorists. Now, that doesn't stop terrorism, but it makes it harder to execute large attacks and ends up with smaller attacks. Now, there will always be terrorists who are incredibly dedicated and will push through regardless of the barriers. But what the NSA's actions, broadly speaking, for addressing this is to increase the cost to be a terrorist.
I think we have a response and then we go to the panel. Quickly, yes?
2 points about the NSA's role in allegedly raising the costs of terror attacks. What about 9/11 and the Boston bombings? Did they stop them?
Do we mean costs as in how much? Just a minute, does it mean, you mean costs like how much it costs to make a bomb or something? Because it doesn't cost anything these days.
No,
so.
Just the effort, all the effort it takes to plan and execute an attack. And this is a statistical approach. You're always going to get outliers, things that fall through the cracks. You can't stop everything.
Okay, Leonid, I think you had a comment?
Yes, very quick, with my Soviet background. You have mass surveillance or you have no surveillance whatsoever. If you have mass surveillance, it will definitely be to the detriment of human rights, that's for sure. But let me elevate the main subject of our discussion to a different level, to the global one. We have a Net Mundial, and we have the roadmap and the principles very well articulated, as some of those participants in Net Mundial thought and still think. But let me just mention that here we are in this European environment discussing all these issues in what may be perceived of a kind of isolated environment, simply because we understand that those roadmap and principles were adopted, were passed by rough consensus, which again for me is a kind of oxymoronic, simply because exactly half of the global populations, or let's say governments that represented half of the global populations, did not sign up for those principles, that roadmap. That rough consensus meant that there were like two islands. So my question is, with this global world and with this trans-border internet, how can we preach these values, being absolutely confident that they are universal, when half of the global population, well, that's an assumption.
So in other words, you're implying there needs to be
do not share them, or just do not stand for them.
So there needs to be a unanimous vote before we do anything. Is that what you're
implying? No. What I mean is that yes, we should keep trying, but we should also understand there is yet another perspective, and we should understand why those people believe that these values, let's say, freedoms of and principles, should be in a certain balance with the security, because they obviously think otherwise.
Okay, yep, so you're questioning the assumption that there needs to be a balance. Jan, do you want to, we better go to the floor, just say who you are.
My name is Sander Venema, and I had a quick addition to the point that John was making. A valid goal, but is that really, does that really justify surveilling billions of people, just to trying to prevent what basically amounts to a really rare occurrence?
Okay.
I mean, it's an enormous cost to...
Can I just add one comment to that before we go further on? We also have to think about the definition of terrorist, if we're going to use this word as justification for the erosion of all our freedoms globally. And at the moment, in the West, in the UK, if you are an activist out there on the streets waving a placard in support of a single issue or something, for example, the Occupy camp in 2011 in London, the local banks were warned by the City of London police that Occupy was deemed to be a domestic extremist / terrorist organisation. So you might be out there protesting, exercising your democratic rights in what you think is your free country, and then lo and behold, you are classed as a terrorist potentially. And we all know what happens to terrorists these days. They get black-bagged, sent off, tortured, or drone struck. So it's a very dangerous slide in terminology, and I think we need to think about that too in this discussion.
Okay, Jan, do you want to continue, and then we'll go back to the floor?
Precisely on
so
this,
definitions
on this
again,
point.
what's a terrorist?
The state has the state has the obligation to protect the population from terrorism, so it has an obligation to take certain measures, but they have to be proportionate and they have to be effective. If the measures are entirely ineffective, I think that the proportionality test fails.
Okay, thank you. I'm just figuring out what we do next. I think remote participants, and then from the floor over here. Yeah, and then Sir Richard. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten you. So Victor from the remote participation.
It was working before.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, now it's working. Marius Postan comments that the Russian spies had Snowden already in their sight 6 years before he exposed the US secrets to the Sunday people. And he's asking, how does the UNESCO inconvenient journalists from China, Russia and Cuba? And then to Mr. Todorov from Ripa George from Romania, he was explaining in a paragraph, like, and questioning how you can think that Iraq was a safe place, and if in UK, Spain and the US people are killed by other people and the government has to protect us, he thinks. And he argues that hundreds of terrorist attacks were avoided because the Secret Service activities.
So in defense of security services, am I right? Annie, you wanted to respond quickly before our patient. Yeah.
Very, very quickly to the comment about Snowden being in, and I've mentioned Snowden. Snowden is an absolute hero. Thank you for exposing the global surveillance state that is being developed by out of control rogue intelligence agencies. But just to pick up on this Russian point, this was a claim made by someone who claims to be a former KGB officer living a very comfortable life in the West now. One has to wonder how he works. And it was published in a newspaper called the Sunday People. Now, it might as well have been published in a Beano or something like that for all the news value you get out of that tabloid. So, it's the sort of newspaper that says, Freddie Starr ate my hamster, or Elvis Presley is living on Mars. So I really wouldn't give that point too much credence. But it's very dangerous because it picks up on some allegations now emerging from the US government saying that Snowden is a traitor, Snowden is working for the Russians. And this, of course, they can say, well, he's hiding in Russia. He ended up in Russia. He was trying to get to Ecuador to permanent asylum. It was only when he was in transit that they took his passport away, and he got stuck in the airport for over a month. So it's a very tendentious argument that the US politicians are using to try and smear an innocent whistleblower.
Okay, thank you. Sir Richard, very briefly, and then we'll turn to the floor.
Well, I just wanted to follow up what Jan was saying earlier on about proportionality and the need for checks and balances, which I entirely support. And in our case, the decisions that we make can be subject to judicial review, so through the courts. That is a proportionate way of doing it. What concerns me, though, is a much wider issue than the sort of material we deal with, which is the capacity that is clearly there for mass surveillance, for mass collection of information about individuals. And that's difficult to challenge because people don't know about it much of the time.
Okay, thank you. So, to the floor, please, sir. Would you...
Hi, Dimitri Kochmaniuk, Housemaster .ua, speaking in personal capacity. I'd just like to make a comment. I heard the word about government having an obligation to protect the citizens from terrorists. Well, I have bad news for you guys. They can't. And somebody brought up the Boston bombings, and I don't think that governments are actually empowered to protect people. As you can see in Ukrainian events, only self-defense forces, even Ukrainian new government, failed to protect its own citizens. Until every person would be armed with the knowledge and tools, let's say in cyberspace, to protect the computer from viruses or other threats, governments are powerless. It's same as until everybody would vaccinate their old children, governments would not stop the disease. So basically, governments are powerless with all the information they have, being that NSA or another organization, to act on that information. And one case in point, Ukrainian CERT had fought a threat of botnet, I think Zeus. They identified 98 ISPs that had the customers being infected. Out of 98, only 8 have acted on the information, and only 1 actually delivered that to their users. So basically only 1 in 98 did something, 7 others did a formal response, and 90 ignored. So what the government can do is very, very limited. And I don't think that collecting information actually helps at all.
Okay,
so basically it's all to the people, including, yes, the weapons.
Okay, so we're moving into the how specifics, but we have a comment from the floor. Is this a new stream of discussion or a response to current one?
No,
so
would be more like a new stream. So if you want to take someone from the panel to respond first, it's go ahead.
Any responses to this? This actually brings in ISPs. Michael wrote it. You mentioned in your preparatory statement about the dark net, and it was kind of like, government's having a hard time, but so is the private sector having a hard time. It's not as straightforward as we think. So do you want to comment on this issue about you can't make them do it if they won't do it?
Well, I can. The dark web, which you mentioned, or which I brought in preparation of this session, came to my mind because it's an area of the web where no search engines and nothings are going to. It's like the red light district of city, of any city in the world. This is one point. There's another point. If you use anonymizers like Tor, you can go into the dark web. You will automatically end up in the dark web and see things which you normally would not see. And my conclusion was, the more governments are doing in blocking, the more they are forcing people to use maybe anonymizers and stuff like that, because whatever they block may end up in the dark web as well. And the more they do blocking and filtering, the more people are using, unfortunately, unwanted, the dark web, and end up where their computers get infected, where they get Trojans and whatever weird things are happening with phishing mails and with all that kind of stuff. And this came to my mind as some kind of a spiral, which ends up, you block unwanted content, this went into the dark web, and people are using more the dark web the more you block. And I think this disturbs this security as well.
Wow. Okay. So we also just, okay, right, let's just get ahead, let me help me get my head around this. We have mass surveillance, runaway spies, and blocking that actually creates more problems than it actually solves. So isn't there at heart here a bit of a myth about some open, beautiful, white, shining, glorious cyberspace where there were no baddies? Are we kind of generating some kind of myth of paradise that has been lost? What is going on here? I'm starting to feel a little concerned, even just because I've had as much a stake in this conversation as all of us here. This talk of dark webs and scary stuff, it is happening. But on the other hand, we still hang out on our various microblogs and our social networks. We put our content up online. So what really is at stake here? I think Annie's made it quite clear what is at stake. It's about giving spies completely undemocratic sorts of powers. I think we have it very clear from Sir Richard that there are things going on that need to be fought and used. Law enforcement officers need to be able to enforce the law because there are seriously illegal things going on. And there's a whole lot of us actually just deeply concerned about the fact that our everyday life is now a tool by which we're being surveyed unreasonably, unnecessarily, and excessively. Okay, I've summed it up for me. I don't know about for you. That's a segue to Mr. Sorry, I've forgotten.
My name is Peter Helmonts.
Okay.
And I have 3 short points to make. One is on the issue of security being defined as thwarting terrorist attacks. And I think it's a question of the proportionality of the reaction to that perceived threat. And it's important, I think, to run statistics. How many people, how many casualties do we have around the globe every year due to terrorist attacks, and put that in perspective with casualties coming from other causes such as traffic accidents and other. And what you will find is that the number of casualties coming from terrorist attacks is very minor compared to those other threats that we every day assume in our daily lives. So if you also put that in comparison to the number of terrorist attacks supposedly thwarted by this surveillance, which is a minuscule amount, then the proportionality is completely out of proportion, because the amount of money spent on the one hand to build up this surveillance apparatus, and on the other hand, the amount of personal freedoms and liberties that we have to give up in order to have that apparatus functioning is completely out of proportion to the threat to our lives. Secondly, the second point is about constitutionality. And if you look at the oath of office that the President of the United States takes, it is not an oath to defend the American people against terrorist attacks. He takes an oath to defend the Constitution. That's the only oath he takes, to defend the Constitution. And what does the Constitution in the US do? It has the Bill of Rights, and it defends personal liberties and civil liberties. So, and that brings me to the third point, the one that you brought up in your summary, which I fully subscribe to. I think the internet is our tool as global citizens to defend our freedoms. And we need to do everything to use the internet in defense of our freedoms, and it will be the best tool for that.
Okay, thank you. I think those points of clarification are important. The internet as a tool, could we also perhaps think about cyberspace as part of the internet? The web, the internet, cyberspace, these are distinct things. As a space, a place where we go, where we do things. Sander, did you want to comment on that? And then our panel might want to respond to those.
I actually wanted to comment on the statement that Sir over there made about the dark web.
Okay, yes, go. And then...
Actually, using Tor does not automatically take you to the dark web. There's a difference between sites hosted on the Tor network, which is what that Sir meant, and using Tor for your anonymity against government surveillance. And that's the main reason why Tor is being used and is being developed, is to protect journalists, to protect whistleblowers, to protect anyone who really has living in suppressive states or really is at a threat of government surveillance.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So Richard.
Well, just a point on the Michael's dark web point, with which I entirely agree, and I've no doubt that some of our activity in terms of blocking and removal from the conventional web has led to movement to the dark web. That's not to say that we won't tackle that. I think we will, but the difficulty, of course, is that as one tackles the next problem, so somebody thinks of some other idea, and all we can do is, as I said at the beginning, we scratch the surface, but we need to scratch a number of different services, which includes the dark web.
Also, I just realised that we've been talking again, remember security, I'm wondering, as Ann Tickner and some of you have been wondering, whether our definition of security is both too narrow and our belief in the security forces too naive. What about, if you think of a locked home, you think of the statistics that most violence against women statistically is happening at home. And that's very secure. It's under lock and key, burglar alarms. So what if we think about security from an internalized point of view as well? So that's something I'd like to shift us to quietly but carefully, because we've had these big statements about human rights as an internet governance principles. This is a great victory. But what's that mean? What does all this reiteration of human rights mean? How do we get from the wish list to the do list in a way that makes sense? So this sounds like a really big question, but my point is we're talking very much about individuals, whereas Annie is talking about whole countries, existential threats. What about the security, safety and rights of communities, LGBT communities, ethnic minorities, bloggers? What about them? What about if the very place they are that is very, very secure is in fact not safe? So I was just wondering if we could talk about shifting from the individual emphasis, if anyone has any comments about what about communities and protections and rights? Maybe nobody wants to answer that.
And thank you. Maybe I just like to respond to the question just raised about the protecting journalists. It is really a very complicated task. Maybe you have known the data. I mean, the past 10 years that globally there are 600 journalists who were killed for reporting those public reporting, and 90 of those victims' cases remain unsolved. So it's a big issue of the impunity as well. So that I just mentioned that we are implementing the UN interagency plan of action. We are just piloted this action in 4 countries, including Nepal, Iraq, Pakistan, and South Sudan. It's really a comprehensive package of the work to do, including creating legal regulatory framework, including creating the capacity building initiative trainings, and also we need to network to create a new alert and protection remedy system. So it's a really resource consuming, it's intensive work to do. So that's what we have done. But just adding to the comment discussion on the national government's the law enforcement on the national security thing, I want to also share an ongoing initiative UN is working on that. There's a steering committee on creating a UN-wide cybersecurity and cybercrime policy framework as a joint initiative of ITU, of UNDP, UNESCO, and several other UN agencies to create, to provide the technical assistance to our member states, I mean every national governments, to provide a template, a human rights-based and a rule of law-based framework to address the cybersecurity issues.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one, can we have one comment from remote participation? Nobody at the moment? Any comments from the floor? Not quite sure. Ah, at the back. Thank you very much. Please come to the microphone. Thank you. Could you just announce your name for the record, please?
Veronica Snoxel from Nuances Public Affairs. Okay, I'm referring about linking this with literacy, really, because you've mentioned about communities, and often that lack of communal literacy, what you call this, empowerment, is often the cause of having again that, let's say, an overpowering representative to either misrepresent or represent accordingly to the, we link it all with security, rights, everything.
Could you give us an explicit example? Because I brought this thing about communities in quite deliberately. I feel we're leaving out a whole part of the world that thinks in communal terms, as communities, not necessarily as a liberal, middle class, well-off, techie individual. So I really want to throw that in there. This is a little bit my pet topic, but I'm...
2 continents, it's in Asia, and the Philippines is like the tribal tribes of the Tibuli tribes in deep down south of Mindanao, and the other one are those in Nigeria who are also, again, you know, misrepresented, basically.
Could you tell us a bit more about that? You're talking about the Mindanao peace initiatives, the peace coalitions, in terms of their needs and uses of the web, or?
Yeah, that in relation, and they are fairly sort of vocal, but there again, this what I would say, the polarity of those who would like to, you know, trying to get the clout of putting their views across. There are those issues still happening, and it's just a matter of, like, again, who has the most connection. And I know I'm, again, branching out to a lot of issues, but these things are happening. And sometimes you would have, okay, there are those who are actually in the field who may get that, let's say, first-hand view, but there again, what is really happening with the core people who have been affected or who are supposed to be represented. So there's, I mean, Nigeria case alone with the Ken Saro-Wiwa, I can deal both sides of that, but there again, I'm occupying or hogging the whole conference. I don't want to do that.
No, thank you. I think these are legitimate questions. We'll keep that new point in mind. Avery?
Get on my tippy toes. Avery Doria. One of the groups I work with, .gay, we work with LGBTQI. Okay, I'll hold it, because we work, tippy toes was hard. We work with various LGBTQI communities around the world, and one of the problems we have found are these aren't endangered communities living in their own environments. In some cases, these are communities who basically can only exist on the internet because the society is so repressive. But as we start to add these security measures, we find out that those security measures, the use of Tor, the use of VPNs, is actually the flag that goes up that tells the local security forces that here is somebody to go look at. Because once you're living in a fully repressive society, the VPN methods and the security methods in the Tor are actually endanger people. And so we're trying to actually find new methods where you can actually be secure without looking at security. And one of the fun things we find is that we can steal techniques from the spies of the First World War and such, where you cannot look like you are hiding something. But for these communities that are so endangered and can only exist online, there's that sort of dual problem that we have to deal with.
Thank you. I would like to sort of, if we can, just develop this a little bit. I think, Sander, you have a point, and then
I just
Jan.
have one point to make for Avery. I think actually there is power in numbers. If millions of people all go use VPNs and use Tor, eventually, you know, the numbers are going to be so big that there's no longer a red flag. I mean, yeah, but if all people in Uganda use Tor, then, I mean, this is theoretical, but...
Yes, sort of, but not in our lifetimes. And it certainly doesn't help those people. You're right in a very theoretical sense. If we all do it, it's safety in numbers, yet it won't happen. I mean, it's a nice dream, but it won't happen. And it especially won't happen in the network illiterate or the less network literate places. So.
Of course, why should people have to use Tor in the first place strikes me as the kind of issue. But I think Jan wants to say something, then Leonard, and then we move to the floor. We're coming up to time, but let's just hang in there. You're concentrating incredibly well. Jan.
Yes, thank you. I was in a conference once where someone proposed that on the argument that Tor is the access to the darknet, that it should be, that the downloading of Tor should be criminalized. I pleaded guilty.
Oh, likewise.
And we don't have in the Council of Europe a standard agreed by the 47 on the downloading of Tor, but we have many other things. We have about anonymity and about secrecy of communications and about safeguards when communications are going to be snooped into. And we have conventions that have been signed by many countries on the protection of children, on the prevention of terrorism and repression of terrorism, on cybercrime, but also on the protection of personal data. And we have a host of instruments that have been developed that set out the understanding of our 47 member states in respect of how to protect and how human rights operate on the internet, in respect of freedom of expression, in respect of blocking and filtering. We even have text concerning net neutrality, concerning human rights and search engines or social networks and so on and so forth, a long list of documents. Many of the things that we have heard here are a detail that has to be explained away, and that the human rights analysis of it gives a very, very clear answer. But this is not the setting for that kind of detailed analysis of every single scenario.
Okay, thank you. And so all the instruments are there, they're just not quite up and going. They're there, you know, kind of sort of ready to go. But Leonard and then Annie, and then we really need to get to the last comments and wrap it up.
Let me just briefly disagree a little bit, because
Briefly,
we in Russia
Leonard.
say, it was one of our greatest authors who once said this, the severity of law in Russia at least is well compensated by no need to abide by that. What I mean right now, I mean, we heard a lot about everything in here, but the human rights dimension was somehow lost during this discussion. Let me get back to that very quickly. Back in 1998, when the US government sort of handed over certain mandate to the ICANN, it was a different world we lived in. There was no Cold War whatsoever. There was a kind of unipolar world with one superpower, libertarian, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Anyway, so free market and personal freedoms dominated the agenda, and the best and the brightest of the Clinton administration were absolutely right by saying that the government should no longer be that big. The pendulum is back now. The government here, I mean the government with capitalized G, is in full power and in full glory these days. Make no mistake. There is no room for human rights whatsoever. The paradise has been lost.
Paradise has been lost. Leonard.
We need to get it back. The question is how to do that. Probably by means of this meaningful discussion, or somehow, I don't know.
Thank you. Annie, then Jeanette, and then we'll turn to Ruth and our friend from the floor. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, but Annie.
Actually, this comment really, I think, sums up the two previous comments I've just heard. I'm very pleased to hear that people in the Council of Europe are downloading Tor, by the way, that's fabulous, and to hear of all the other good work that our EU institutions are trying to start on this front. One way that they could move really quickly and get some rights back for us, we the citizens of Europe, is to instigate the recommendations of a 13-year-old report that the European Parliament actually produced in July 2001. Now, this was the Echelon report. Echelon was the proto Five Eyes surveillance system. So all the Anglophone countries sharing all their intelligence take and thereby subverting all the accountability rules in each other's countries. So it was a fabulous system. The Echelon report basically said, we need to protect our European citizens, their basic rights. And to do this, we need to get away from this dependency on closed proprietary US software. We need to start using open source software, open standards, develop our own local economies within Europe, build our own infrastructure and educate our youth in these new areas. Plus, of course, if you have that, it makes the surveillance incredibly difficult for them to do. And we need that because at the moment, what we've seen from Edward Snowden is, for example, the Tempora program, where the spies via GCHQ and the NSA are mainlining all the communications coming across the Atlantic. They're just sucking it out of the fiber optic cables. That is everything. And our Foreign Secretary, William Hague, said, hey, it's okay, I signed the warrant for this. It is legal under UK law. Well, he's being very elastic with the concept of legality, one, but even so, who is he, the British Foreign Secretary, to take upon himself the signing away and approving the intercept of communications of 500 million Europeans in 28 different countries? That is what he's done. We didn't elect him. Well, most of the British people didn't elect him either. But so I think one of the recommendations, go back, look at the Echelon report and start building up our own local knowledge base and our own local economies and take the control away from the American NSA and the American conglomerate giants.
And the spies. Okay. Right, now just bear with us because we're coming to a natural end and I'd like to round it up by just flagging to the panel that one sentence to finish up with future visions, just to think quickly. From our floor, very briefly, sir, and then Ruth, who's standing behind you.
I'll try to be more brief than last time.
Be brief, don't try to be brief, be brief.
You asked, you asked how, and that is something that we haven't processed yet, or that we haven't discussed yet. I would like to encourage everybody to think why we have managed to level security, anonymity, accountability, something that I haven't heard, a word that I haven't heard today at all in this session, in the carbon world, and why we can't balance it in the online world. There's some underlying principles that we haven't generated yet in the online world. And that's the reason why we have other systems, like for instance, national security systems, overshooting their competences.
Okay, thank you very much. Point well taken. Thank you. Ruth.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to say that there's kind of some parallels between the arms trade and the weapons trade and with the trade of technologies that we're talking a lot about countries, developing countries and different countries like spying on each other and spying on us and using technology to do that, but we're not talking about where that technology comes from, and a lot of the technology that's produced in Europe is then exported and governments in other parts of the world are using that. And I was wondering kind of like, yeah, like what restrictions should be on the sort of trade, and also allowing the activists in those different countries to have access to technologies in the same time, like how we can kind of balance that
Double
trade.
standard, you mean, in terms of actually exporting cyber warfare tools, but at the same time claiming to be helping activists against the governments that are using the tools that they just bought from the EU. Okay. I don't know if we can answer that, Ruth, but I think it was very important to put on the record. I know that, are there any responses at this point? I think I'd like to try and move into the wrap-up moment. And the reason why I've thought is possibly a bit crazy, but I think part of the internet is about our future. It's certainly the younger generations just take it for granted that cyberspace is where they go, social media is what they use. So if we were to end today in a kind of more philosophical bent, and I mean that quite seriously, you can't change what people think, but you can sometimes change the way they think about what they think. So we've moved from individuals to communities to minorities to whether the best disguise is no disguise at all. But let's just stop and think for a minute. I'm going to ask my esteemed panelists to just in one sentence, if possible. It's called blue skies thinking. Sorry. Okay, before we do that, we'll have what their future vision is of the web, the internet, cyberspace. But before that, just one point from the remote.
Thank you. Ripa George from Romania writes, I think it's outrageous that Mr. Todorov and Ms. Macon complains about the freedom in the US and the EU, but has no problem with what happens in Russia, China and other countries. And one question for Ms. Macon. What do you think about Mr. Putin? Do you think he's a tyrant or Democrat? Thank you.
You may exercise your right not to answer. Want to hear what she wants to say?
I think he's a very canny operator, and he is outpacing and outthinking President Obama, Cameron, many other Western leaders, not only in what's been going on with the Crimea, but also the way he stalled yet another NATO invasion in Syria last year. He has a great deal of power, so does Obama, and so do all the rest of our leaders. And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to distinguish who abuses state power or surveillance power more. Is it in Russia or is it in America, with the willing acceptance and help of its vassal state, the UK?
Okay, so that brings us to what kind of future vision are we talking about? If the internet, broadly defined, is a vision of the future or a metaphor, an analogy for how we want to live in the world, which is technical, political, economic, social, and all the rest. So do you want to try, if you don't feel like you want to say something, what would be your one-sentence vision for the future? Just to get us thinking in another frame. Anyone want to go? Sir Richard? One sentence, otherwise, because I just have one thing to end.
I've got a microphone. Well, I mean simply that I think the notion of a entirely free internet is probably utopian, and someone in the audience said we just have to accept that there are some limits to the freedoms in order to protect other important rights. I think all of that needs codifying much better than it is at the moment. We need protocols, international protocols, and they need to be protected by international institutions.
Thank you very much. Michael, for you? I can bring away the microphone.
Only a few words. Digital disarmament. That's what we need, and then restart the discussion.
Olivier, I think that segues to you. Digital disarmament. Others of you can tweet what your future vision is if you want to.
I think that whilst today the internet has allowed Big Brother to be watching you, I'm hoping that tomorrow's internet will allow you to watch Big Brother.
Thank you. Continuing.
My recommendation for the future would be to assert human rights. Every time there is a violation and interference, assert your rights. In order to facilitate that, the Council of Europe has adopted all these texts, including more recently a guide on the rights of internet users from a human rights perspective. Assert your rights. If you don't do it, if we don't do it collectively, we may end up on a 21st century gulag.
Okay, and Leonid, your one sentence, then Annie and Gris and Chaillon.
Message from the former gulag. I believe it is through enlightenment, education, and passion and commitment to those values we hold dear, no matter what my Romanian opponent would say.
Thank you, thank you. And Annie?
Picking up on what Jan said, I would highlight one special right, which is the right to privacy, enshrined in 1948 for a very good reason in the immediate aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War. And if we don't take steps individually to ensure our own privacy, and we can on the internet, we can use open source software, we can use Tor, we can use encryption, and respect others' right to privacy as well by so doing, then we will have, we will lose our very foundation for democracy. That is the nature of privacy.
Thank you. Agree?
Yeah, speaking of freedom,
I think right now there's this kind of myth that we are voluntarily, and also when we talk about young people, they're voluntarily participating in this surveillance system when they use Facebook and Google and so on and so forth. My wish for the future is that these young people, this generation, actually have an alternative, and alternative business services built on alternative business models, alternative technical structures, so on and so forth, that actually protect their right to privacy, rather than forcing them to participate or not. That's the only alternative right now.
Chanyeol?
I like to conclude by quoting the recent remark of the UN Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon's remarks. He said that national security and criminal activity may justify some exceptional and narrowly tailored use of surveillance, but that is all the more reason to safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Thank you. And I would just like to end with the words of W.B. Yeats, a poet, whose famous line, "Tread softly because you tread on my dreams," is graffitied on about the third lamppost between here and Kupfergraben. So you will see. But I looked up the poem because I'd forgotten the rest of it. So this, I'm going to quote from W.B. Yeats. It's half a minute. Right, you ready? Had I heaven's embroidered cloths enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly because you tread on my dreams. Thank you very much. I think that will come.